wide eyes, shock and fear, and something that might have been hope warring in her expression. But before she could respond, he was gone, striding back into the corridor and toward the entrance hall where Lady Whitmore was bidding farewell to her guests. The Duke thanked his hostess with perfect courtesy, complimented the excellence of her table, and made vague noises about future engagements that committed him to nothing, and all the while his mind was turning over the name he had learned, Arabella Fairfax, repeating it to himself like a talisman. In the carriage rolling through the dark London streets toward his own residence, Sebastian sat in the shadows and thought about amber eyes and silent tears, about a woman who had forgotten her own name until a stranger asked for it, and he made himself a promise that he would not rest until he understood the full story of how Arabella Fairfax had been erased and what it would take to make her visible again. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March when the sky was the color of pewter and a cold rain drummed against the windows of the Whitmore townhouse. And Arabella was in the scullery helping the kitchen maid scrub pots when the butler appeared in the doorway with an expression of puzzled disapproval. "There is a delivery," he announced, his tone suggesting that deliveries were inherently suspect, addressed to a Miss Arabella Fairfax in care of this residence. "Does anyone know of such a person?" Arabella's hands went still in the washing water, her heart beginning to pound with a force that made her dizzy, because no one had sent her anything in 10 years. No one had addressed her by name in 10 years, and the very fact of a package with her full name written upon it felt like a validation of her existence that was almost too overwhelming to comprehend. The other servants turned to look at her, the cook and the scullery maid and the 2 housemaids, and she saw recognition in their faces because they all knew who she really was, had always known even if they were forbidden to speak of it, and the cook gave a small nod of encouragement that made Arabella's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "That would be me," she said quietly, her voice barely steady. "I am Arabella Fairfax." The butler's eyebrows rose, but he said nothing, merely handed her the package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and Arabella took it with trembling hands and carried it up the back stairs to her attic room because she could not bear to open it in front of witnesses, could not risk having this moment, whatever it was, observed and judged and potentially taken from her. In the privacy of her narrow room, she sat on the edge of her bed and carefully untied the string, unwrapped the paper, and found herself looking at a book bound in the most beautiful leather she had ever seen, deep green morocco with gilt lettering on the spine. The Complete Poetical Works of William Wordsworth, the title read, and tucked inside the front cover was a card in a bold masculine hand that said simply, "For Miss Arabella Fairfax, who deserves beautiful things, with the compliments of the Duke of Ashford." She ran her fingers over the leather, feeling the quality of it, the craftsmanship. And then she opened the book, and the scent of new paper and fine binding rose up to meet her, and for a moment she could not breathe for the joy of it, the sheer overwhelming joy of being seen, being remembered, being given something precious simply because someone thought she deserved it. She turned to her favorite poem, Tintern Abbey, and began to read, and the words were the same words she had read in her mother's old volume hidden under her mattress. But they looked different in this beautiful edition, looked somehow more real, more valid, and she felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she read about the still sad music of humanity and the sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused. She did not hear the door open, did not hear the footsteps on the stairs, and the first indication she had that she was no longer alone was Lady Whitmore's voice cutting through the room like a whip. "What is that?" the older woman demanded, and Arabella looked up to find Lady Whitmore standing in the doorway with Lydia behind her, both of them staring at the book in Arabella's hands with expressions of outrage and something that looked almost like fear. "It is a gift, my lady," Arabella said, rising to her feet and instinctively holding the book behind her back as though she could protect it from what was coming. "A gift," Lady Whitmore repeated, her voice rising. "A gift from whom? What gentleman sends gifts to a servant? Bring that here at once." Arabella hesitated for a fatal second, and then Lady Whitmore was crossing the room and snatching the book from her hands, and Arabella watched in horror as the older woman examined it, saw the card tucked inside, read the inscription, and her face went white, and then red with fury. "The Duke of Ashford," Lady Whitmore hissed. "You have been receiving attentions from the Duke of Ashford. Who do you think you are, receiving gifts from gentlemen? Have you been whoring yourself to him? Is that it? Using your position in this house to attract his notice and offer him your availability?" The accusation was so vile, so utterly false and cruel, that Arabella felt something inside her snap, a cord that had been pulled taut for 10 years suddenly breaking, and before she could stop herself, words were pouring out of her mouth, words she had not dared to speak in a decade. "I have done nothing wrong," she said, and her voice was shaking but clear. "I have done nothing to encourage the Duke's attention beyond existing in his presence. He is a kind man who noticed I exist, something this family has not done in 10 years. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of rain against the window and Arabella's ragged breathing, and she saw shock ripple across Lady Whitmore's face, followed by a rage so pure it was almost incandescent. "You forget yourself, girl," Lady Whitmore said, her voice low and venomous. "We took you in when you had nothing. When your parents died and left you penniless, we gave you a home and employment. This is how you repay our charity, by tempting a duke with your—" She paused, searching for words cutting enough to wound. "With your aging charms and your presumption." Something broke loose in Arabella then, 10 years of silence and submission and swallowed rage. And she heard herself speaking words she had never intended to say aloud, truths that had festered in the darkness of her silence. "You took me in, and then you took everything from me," she said, and her voice was steady now, hard as stone. "My inheritance, my name, my life. I was 18 years old. I trusted you. I believed you when you said the money was gone, when you said I should be grateful for a position in your household. But I was not penniless. My parents left me £8,000. Where did it go? My lady, where did my mother's money go?" Lady Whitmore's hand came up fast and cracked across Arabella's cheek with enough force to snap her head to the side, and the pain was sharp and bright and somehow clarifying, and Arabella raised her hand to her burning cheek and looked at the woman who had stolen her life and felt no fear, only a cold, clear certainty that something had changed irrevocably, that she had spoken and could not unspeak, had claimed her name and her history and could not unclaim them. "Your inheritance was spent on your upkeep, you ungrateful wretch," Lady Whitmore spat. 10 years of food and shelter and clothing, that is where your precious inheritance went. My inheritance could have supported me for life," Arabella replied, her voice quiet but implacable. "It could have provided me with an independent living, with the ability to choose my own path. You took that from me, and you gave me servitude in its place. You erased my name and made me invisible, and I let you because I was young and frightened and alone. But I am not that girl any more." Lady Whitmore clutched the book to her chest, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. "You will apologize this instant," she said. "You will get on your knees and beg my forgiveness for your insolence, and you will burn this book in the kitchen fire. And if you do so, I may allow you to remain in this household. But if you refuse, you will leave at once, without references, and without a penny to your name. Do you understand me?" Arabella looked at the book in Lady Whitmore's hands, at the beautiful green leather and the gilt lettering, at the symbol of her name and her existence and someone's kindness, and she felt the choice before her like a physical weight. She could apologize, could abase herself one more time, could watch the book burn and retreat back into silence and invisibility, could survive as she had survived for 10 years by making herself nothing. Or she could hold on to what she had reclaimed, her voice and her name, and her right to exist, and face whatever consequences came. Before she could speak, before she could make the choice that would determine everything that followed, there was a commotion from below, the sound of the front door opening, the butler's voice raised in surprise, and then footsteps on the main staircase, rapid and purposeful. Lady Whitmore turned toward the door just as Lord Whitmore appeared, his face flushed with agitation. "The Duke of Ashford is here," he announced, his voice tight with barely suppressed panic. "He has called on some pretext of business and is asking for you in the drawing-room. He is asking—" His voice dropped to a hiss, "about a Miss Fairfax and whether she received a book he sent." Lady Whitmore's face went through several interesting transformations, fury giving way to calculation, giving way to a forced smile that looked more like a grimace. "Lydia," she said sharply, "go down and entertain his grace. Tell him I shall be there momentarily. You?" She gestured at Arabella without looking at her directly. "You will remain here and not show your face. Do you understand? You will stay in this room until I decide what is to be done with you." She swept from the room with the book still clutched in her hands, Lydia following, and Lord Whitmore paused in the doorway to give Arabella a look of such venom that she took an involuntary step backward. "You have destroyed this family's prospects," he said quietly. "Whatever relationship we might have built with the Duke is now tainted by your presumption. I hope you are satisfied." Then he too was gone, and Arabella was left alone in her attic room with her burning cheek and her racing heart, and the terrible exhilaration of having spoken, having claimed herself, having broken free of the silence that had been her prison. She moved to the small window that looked out over the mews behind the house and pressed her forehead against the cold glass, trying to calm her breathing, trying to think through what would happen next. The Duke was downstairs, had come to the house, had asked about her by name, and she did not know whether to feel gratitude or horror because his attention had protected her and endangered her in equal measure. Below in the drawing-room, Sebastian Wentworth sat with his usual composure and watched Lady Whitmore's face as she entered, noted the high colour in her cheeks and the way her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirts, and knew that something significant had just occurred, though he could not yet determine what. Lord Whitmore followed his wife into the room, his expression guarded, and Lydia positioned herself on the sofa with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Your Grace," Lady Whitmore said, her voice straining for its usual obsequious warmth. "What an unexpected pleasure. My husband mentioned you had business to discuss." Sebastian smiled blandly, the smile he used when he was maneuvering someone into a position they did not wish to occupy. "Indeed," he said, "though business is perhaps too strong a word, I merely wished to make a courtesy call. We had such a pleasant evening at your dinner party last week, and I wanted to inquire after everyone's health." "How very kind," Lady Whitmore murmured. "We are all quite well, thank you." Sebastian let a small pause develop, a silence just long enough to become slightly uncomfortable, and then he said with perfect casualness, "I do hope Miss Fairfax received the volume I sent. I recalled her mentioning Wordsworth during our conversation at dinner. He lies smoothly. They had never discussed poetry, had barely exchanged 3 words in company, but the Whitmores could not know this, and I thought she might enjoy a handsome edition of the complete works." The silence that followed was exquisite, Lady Whitmore's mouth opening and closing soundlessly, Lord Whitmore's face darkening with suppressed fury, Lydia looking between her parents with growing alarm, and Sebastian waited with an expression of polite inquiry, as though he had asked about nothing more significant than the weather. Miss Fairfax, Lady Whitmore finally managed, her voice strangled. How thoughtful of your Grace. I am sure the girl— that is, I am sure Miss Fairfax was quite surprised by your generosity. The girl, or Miss Fairfax? Sebastian asked gently, his tone mild but his eyes sharp. I confess I am uncertain which form of address you prefer, though I myself favor the latter as it seems more, shall we say, respectful. Lady Whitmore's smile was a rictus of social necessity. Of course, Miss Fairfax, she said, stumbling over the name as though it were in a foreign language. She was most surprised, most grateful. I imagine she was. Sebastian replied. It is a handsome edition, bound in green morocco. I selected it myself from Hatchard's. I do hope she enjoys it. Wordsworth has always seemed to me a poet who speaks to the soul of those who have experienced both beauty and loss. He let that observation hang in the air, weighted with implications, and watched Lord Whitmore shift uncomfortably in his chair. Your Grace is too kind to take notice of our household staff, the older man said, his voice gruff. On the contrary, Sebastian said, his voice cooling by several degrees, I believe it is a mark of a gentleman's character how he treats those in positions of service, and Miss Fairfax struck me during dinner as a woman of some education and refinement. One wonders how she came to be in service at all. The question was a rapier thrust, precise and lethal, and Sebastian saw Lord Whitmore's face go pale, even as Lady Whitmore's flushed darker. She is our distant cousin, Lady Whitmore said stiffly. Orphaned young. We took her in out of Christian charity when she had nowhere else to go. How very generous, Sebastian murmured, and I trust she is grateful for such benevolence. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut, and Sebastian rose with fluid grace, judging that he had accomplished what he came to do, had forced them to acknowledge Arabella by name, had made clear that her existence was known to him and mattered to him, had put them on notice that she was not as invisible as they wished her to be. I shall not take up any more of your valuable time, he said, bowing to Lady Whitmore with perfect courtesy. Please do convey my regards to Miss Fairfax. I hope the volume brings her pleasure. He departed with the same calm authority with which he had arrived, and in his wake he left a household in turmoil. Lady Whitmore White lipped with rage, Lord Whitmore pouring himself a large brandy despite the early hour, and Lydia demanding to know what was happening and being told sharply to be quiet. Upstairs in her attic room, Arabella heard the front door close, heard the Duke's carriage pull away, and she sank down onto her narrow bed with her head in her hands, shaking with reaction to everything that had happened in the space of an hour. She had spoken her truth, had claimed her name, had been struck and threatened and saved all at once, and she did not know what would come next. But she knew with absolute certainty that she could not go back to silence, could not return to being the invisible girl who had forgotten her own name. The book was gone, confiscated by Lady Whitmore, but the fact of it remained. The Duke had sent her something beautiful, had called her by name, had noticed she existed, and that could not be taken back, no matter what happened. She touched her burning cheek where Lady Whitmore had struck her, and felt not pain, but a strange, fierce joy, because the slap was proof that she was real, that she had impact, that she could no longer be ignored or erased. Arabella Fairfax, she whispered to herself in the gathering dusk. My name is Arabella Fairfax, and I exist. Arabella could not sleep, had not truly slept since the morning of the book and the confrontation, and the Duke's strategic appearance in the drawing-room 3 days ago, and she lay in her narrow attic bed, watching the moonlight creep across the sloped ceiling, and felt the restless energy that came from having broken a decade of silence, and discovered that the world had not ended, that she was still breathing, still existing, still somehow intact, despite having shattered every rule that had governed her survival. Lady Whitmore had not dismissed her, had not carried through on her threat to turn her out without references, and Arabella suspected this was because the Duke's pointed inquiries had made it clear that Arabella's invisibility was no longer guaranteed, that her mistreatment might have consequences beyond the walls of the Whitmore household. The book had disappeared, confiscated, and presumably destroyed, but its ghost remained. The fact of it, the Duke's recognition of her name and her worthiness to receive beautiful things, and she found herself returning again and again to the moment when she had held it in her hands, had felt the quality of the leather, had read the inscription, "For Miss Arabella Fairfax, who deserves beautiful things." She rose finally when the clock in the hall below struck midnight, unable to bear the confines of her small room any longer, and she pulled on her wrapper over her plain cotton nightgown and took the candle from beside her bed, shielding the flame with her hand as she descended the servants' stairs on bare feet that made no sound on the worn wood. She knew where she was going, though the knowledge felt dangerous, felt like another transgression in a week that had been full of them. But she could not stop thinking about what she had said to Lady Whitmore. My inheritance could have supported me for life. Where did my mother's money go? And she wanted proof. Needed proof, needed to see with her own eyes what had become of the £8,000 that should have been hers. The library was on the ground floor, a room she was permitted to enter only to dust and sweep, never to read or linger, and it was Lord Whitmore's domain, filled with his ledgers and correspondence and the accumulated books of 3 generations of Whitmores who had been more interested in appearing cultured than in actual learning. She turned the handle slowly, wincing at the small click of the latch, and slipped inside, closing the door behind her with infinite care. The room was silver with moonlight streaming through the tall windows that faced the garden, and the leather spines of hundreds of books gleamed dully in the pale light. And for a moment, Arabella simply stood there, breathing in the scent of old paper and dust and furniture polish, feeling like a thief in a place that should have been available to her, that would have been available to her if her life had taken the path it was meant to take. She set her candle on the desk and began to search, opening drawers as quietly as she could manage, her hands shaking with nerves and the transgressive thrill of doing something forbidden. Lord Whitmore kept his ledgers in the large bottom drawer. She knew this from cleaning the room, and she pulled them out one by one, running her fingers down columns of numbers that meant little to her untrained eye, looking for her name, for some record of the inheritance, for proof of what had happened to her parents' careful savings. The entries were cryptic, abbreviations and codes that she could not decipher, but she kept searching, turning pages by candlelight, and she was so absorbed in the task that she did not hear the library door open, did not hear the footsteps crossing the carpet, did not know she was no longer alone until a voice spoke from the shadows near the fireplace. "Looking for something in particular?" the voice asked, and it was a gentle voice, a familiar voice, but Arabella's heart still leapt into her throat, and she spun around so quickly she nearly knocked over the candle. The Duke of Ashford stood beside one of the leather armchairs, a book in his hand, and he was dressed informally in shirt-sleeves and waistcoat, with his cravat loosened, and even in her panic, Arabella registered that this was the most human she had ever seen him, the most accessible, the careful ducal armor set aside for the private hours of night. "Your Grace," she stammered, rising to her feet and nearly tripping over her wrapper in her haste. "I did not know. I thought everyone was— Forgive me. I should not be here. I will go at once." She moved toward the door, but he raised a hand to stop her, his expression not angry but concerned, curious, and something else she could not quite identify. "Please do not go on my account," he said. "I am the interloper here. I could not sleep and came down to find something to read. I did not mean to startle you." And he paused, studying her face in the candlelight. "But I am curious what brings you to the library at midnight. What were you searching for in those ledgers?" Arabella stood frozen between the desk and the door, her mind racing through possible explanations and finding none that did not reveal too much, that did not make her seem foolish or presumptuous or dangerously naive. She could lie, could claim she was looking for household accounts on Lady Whitmore's orders, but something in his face told her he would know the lie, would see through it, and besides she was tired of lying, tired of hiding, tired of the careful erasure of her own truth. "I was looking for proof," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Proof of what happened to my inheritance, to the money my parents left me. I wanted to see it written down, wanted to understand where it went and how." Sebastian set down his book and moved closer, not crowding her but closing the distance between them until he stood on the other side of the desk, the ledgers spread between them like evidence in a trial. "Tell me," he said quietly. "Tell me everything. From the beginning." And so she did, the words spilling out of her in the silver darkness, the whole story that she had carried silently for 10 years, finally given voice. She told him about her childhood, about her mother Emmeline, who had played the pianoforte and read poetry, about her father Thomas, who had been a gentleman of modest means but careful habits, about how they had both died within a week of the fever when she was 16, and she had been sent to live with the Whitmores, her mother's distant cousins, the only family she had left in the world. She told him about the 2 years when she had been their ward, raised alongside Lydia, educated by the same governess, dressed in muslins and taught to dance and paint and sing, promised a small London season when she turned 18, promised a future that seemed secure, if not brilliant. "I was so young," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I had no one. My parents were dead. The Whitmores were my only family. When Lord Whitmore told me the investments had failed, that the money was gone, I believed him. I had no reason not to. I knew nothing of finance or law or how trusts were managed. I was 18 years old and terrified and completely alone." Sebastian listened without interrupting, his face growing harder with each revelation, and in the candlelight she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the edge of the desk as though he needed to hold on to something solid to keep from doing violence to the furniture, or the walls, or the absent Lord Whitmore. "Did you ever see documentation?" he asked when she paused. "Proof of the failed investments, any legal papers explaining what had happened to the trust?" She shook her head. "No, he said it was too distressing for me to review, that I should not trouble myself with such unpleasant business. He said I should be grateful they were offering me a position in the household, rather than turning me out with nothing, that they would provide for me, that I would always have a home here. What choice did I have? Where could I have gone? I had no money, no other family, no skills beyond what a lady's education provides, which is to say nothing practical, nothing that would allow me to earn my keep. So I said yes. I agreed to become Lydia's maid, and at first I told myself it was temporary, that perhaps the investments would recover, that perhaps Lord Whitmore would restore my inheritance when the family's fortunes improved. But as the months turned into years, I began to understand that I would never see that money again, that I had been quietly and completely dispossessed, and the knowledge of it, the helplessness of it, made me want to disappear entirely. And so I did. I stopped speaking unless spoken to. I stopped using my name. I let them erase me because being erased was easier than fighting a battle I could not possibly win." The tears were sliding down her cheeks now, though she had not meant to cry, had not wanted to appear weak or pitiable, but the relief of telling the story, of giving voice to 10 years of silent grief and rage and resignation was overwhelming, and she could not stop the tears any more than she could stop the words. "I have not said my own name in 10 years, she whispered, "until you asked me to, until you looked at me in the park and asked me what my name was, as though I were a person who deserved to have one, and I could not answer you because I had forgotten, not intellectually but in some deeper way. I had forgotten that I was Arabella Fairfax, that I was my mother's daughter, that I was someone." Sebastian was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "Arabella," he said, and then paused. "May I call you Arabella?" She nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. And he continued. "Arabella, what they did was illegal. If your parents left you an inheritance, it was held in trust. Those funds could not simply disappear without documentation. Trusts are governed by law, by courts, by solicitors who have a legal obligation to act in the beneficiary's interest. Either Lord Whitmore is a spectacularly unlucky investor who can produce records of catastrophic losses, or he is a thief who stole your money and has spent the past 10 years benefiting from your labor without compensation." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and clear and utterly damning, and Arabella felt something shift in her chest, a small fierce flame of hope that she had not allowed herself to feel in a decade. "Even if you are right," she said, her voice shaking, "I have no power, no recourse. I am a servant without references, without connections, without means. Who would believe me if I made such an accusation? Who would listen to my claims against a family of Lord Whitmore's standing?" "I believe you," Sebastian said quietly, "and I am not without influence." He came around the desk then, closing the distance between them, and before she quite understood what he intended, he had taken both her hands in his, and the touch was warm and solid, and utterly devastating in its simple human kindness. "You are not alone any more," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "Arabella Fairfax, you are not a servant, you are a woman who has been grievously wronged, and I intend to help you rectify it. I have solicitors, I have access to court records, I have the social standing to make inquiries that you cannot make, and I will not rest until I understand exactly what happened to your inheritance and what can be done to restore it to you." Arabella stared at him, at this man she barely knew who was offering her something she had not dared to hope for: justice, restitution, the possibility of reclaiming not just her money, but her name, her identity, her place in the world. And she could not comprehend why he would do this, what she could possibly mean to him that he would involve himself in her troubles. "Why?" she asked, the single word encompassing all her confusion and disbelief. "Why do you care what happens to me?" He was quiet for a moment, his thumbs moving gently across her knuckles in a gesture that felt both comforting and intimate. And when he spoke, his voice was very soft. "Because you deserve justice," he said. "Because what was done to you was wrong, and I cannot stand by and allow it to continue unchallenged, because in a world full of people who perform kindness for social advantage, you are genuinely kind, despite having every reason to be bitter, because you have survived a decade of cruelty with your essential self intact, and that takes a strength I find extraordinary. And because—" he paused, his eyes searching hers, "because when I speak your name, I see you come alive. I see you remember who you are, and I want you to have the opportunity to be that person fully, without constraint, without fear, without the weight of injustice pressing you down into silence." The tears were coming harder now, tears of grief and relief and something that felt dangerously close to joy. and Sebastian released one of her hands to pull a handkerchief from his pocket and offer it to her with the same gentle courtesy he had shown when he knelt in the dirt to retrieve her fallen shawl in the park. She took it and pressed it to her face, breathing in the scent of his cologne, sandalwood, and something citrus. And when she looked up at him again, he was smiling slightly. A small, sad smile that acknowledged the strangeness and intimacy of this midnight meeting. "Arabella," he said, "just her name, nothing more." And then again, "Arabella, Arabella," as though he were making up for 10 years of silence, as though he could resurrect her simply by speaking her name enough times. The moonlight painted them both in silver, turned the library into a place outside of time, and Arabella felt the world narrow to just this room, this man, this moment of being seen and known and believed. She had come down here looking for proof in ledgers and accounts, cold documentary evidence of theft. But what she had found instead was something warmer and more dangerous, someone who looked at her and saw not a servant or a victim, but a person, Arabella Fairfax, a woman with a history and a future, a woman who deserved beautiful things. "Thank you," she whispered, inadequate words for the enormity of what he was offering, but the only words she had. "Thank you for believing me, for seeing me, for saying my name as though it matters." "It does matter," Sebastian said fiercely. "You matter, Arabella Fairfax. You have always mattered, even when the world tried to convince you otherwise. And I swear to you that I will do everything in my power to help you reclaim what was stolen from you. Your inheritance, yes, but more than that, your name, your voice, your right to exist in the world as yourself, rather than as someone's invisible servant." They stood there in the silver darkness with their hands joined, and the ledgers spread across the desk like accusations, and Arabella felt herself transformed, felt the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming existing simultaneously in this moment, and she knew that whatever happened next, whatever investigations or confrontations or legal battles lay ahead, she would never again be the invisible woman who had forgotten her own name, because Sebastian Wentworth, Duke of Ashford, had looked at her in a library at midnight and called her Arabella as though it were a prayer, as though her name were the most important word he knew, and she believed him. Spring arrived in London with a rush of green and gold, the squares and gardens suddenly alive with daffodils and early roses, and the transformation of the city seemed to mirror something shifting inside Arabella herself, a gradual unfurling after years of being tightly closed against the cold. Sebastian hired a solicitor the day after their midnight meeting in the library. A discreet man named Mr. Henshaw, who specialized in trust law and had a reputation for both competence and confidentiality. And while the investigation proceeded quietly in the background, Sebastian himself became a frequent visitor to the Whitmore household, appearing with such regularity that even Lady Whitmore's transparent delight at having secured the Duke's continued attention began to curdle into anxiety as she sensed something in his manner that she could not quite identify, some purpose beyond the ostensible courtship of Lydia that made her uneasy. He came for tea and stayed for dinner. He came for dinner and lingered in the drawing-room afterward. He accepted invitations to musical evenings and card parties, and each time he found ways to speak with Arabella, manufacturing small requests that the Whitmores could not refuse without appearing churlish or suspicious. He asked that she bring him tea in the study when he was closeted with Lord Whitmore discussing some fabricated business matter. He wandered into the garden at precisely the hour when she was cutting flowers for the dining table. He expressed interest in borrowing a book from the library and requested that she retrieve it for him because she would know where such things were kept. The Whitmores watched these interactions with growing alarm, but could do nothing to prevent them without openly acknowledging that they wished to keep Arabella away from the Duke, and such an acknowledgement would require explaining why a mere servant merited such concern, would risk exposing the very situation they had worked so hard to conceal. Arabella found herself living in a state of constant anticipation, never knowing when Sebastian would appear, when she would turn a corner and find him there with some excuse to speak with her. And the conversations that resulted were unlike anything she had experienced in 10 years. He asked her opinion on books, on poetry, on the paintings that hung in the Whitmore drawing room, and at first she answered haltingly, uncertainly, as though she had forgotten how to engage in genuine discourse rather than simply receiving orders. But gradually her responses grew longer, more confident, and she felt something waking inside her that had been dormant so long she had thought it dead. Her mind, her education, her ability to think and speak and engage with ideas. "Tell me about your childhood," Sebastian said one afternoon in the garden, where he had found her cutting tulips, their heads heavy with spring rain. "What did you love?" The question was so simple and yet so profound, asking not what she had done but what she had loved, asking about joy rather than duty, and Arabella found herself answering with a honesty that surprised her. "I loved reading," she said, arranging the tulips in her basket with care. "My mother and I would read poetry together. We had a favorite seat by the window in our old house. The light was best there in the afternoons. We would take turns reading aloud. Wordsworth especially. She loved Wordsworth, the way he wrote about nature and memory and the relationship between them. She died when I was 16. My father followed a year later. The fever took them both within a week." Sebastian was quiet for a moment, his face grave with sympathy. "You have endured so much loss," he said gently. "We all endure, Your Grace." Arabella replied, "Some of us just have less choice in the matter. Loss comes to everyone eventually. The question is only what we do with it, whether we let it destroy us or whether we find a way to carry it and continue." "Sebastian," he said abruptly, and when she looked up at him in confusion, he continued, "When we are alone, call me Sebastian. You said your name for me. The least I can do is offer mine in return." She stared at him, shocked by the intimacy of such a request, the impropriety of it. "I could not possibly," she began, but he shook his head. "You can," he said. "You are not my servant, Arabella. You never were. You are a woman who has been wronged and whom I am attempting to help, and I would very much like it if, when we speak privately, you would use my Christian name as I use yours." The suggestion hung between them in the spring air, weighted with implications that made Arabella's heart race, and after a long moment she nodded, unable to speak, but willing to accept this small rebellion against the hierarchy that had governed every interaction of her adult life. "Sebastian," she said, testing the name on her tongue, and he smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually reserved features into something warm and almost boyish. "Much better," he said, and then someone called from the house, Lady Whitmore's voice sharp with suspicion, and they both stepped apart as though they had been caught in some transgression far more serious than a conversation about poetry. The visits continued throughout April and into May, and Arabella found herself changing in small but significant ways. She began to take more care with her appearance, not dramatically but subtly, pinning her hair in a softer style that framed her face, standing straighter, meeting people's eyes rather than keeping her gaze fixed on the floor. The other servants noticed, and their response was not jealousy, but quiet support. The cook slipping her extra portions at meals, the housemaids offering to help with her work so she had more time to rest, the butler treating her with a deference that acknowledged her true status as the wronged ward rather than the invisible maid. They had always known the truth of her situation, had always understood that what the Whitmores had done to her was cruel and probably illegal, but they had been powerless to intervene, and now that the Duke himself had taken an interest, they felt emboldened to show her small kindnesses, to acknowledge in gesture what they could not say aloud. Arabella kept wildflowers in a chipped teacup on the windowsill of her attic room, daffodils and primroses and tiny violets that she gathered from the corners of the garden. And sometimes when she woke in the early morning light, she would look at them and feel something that was almost happiness, a lightness in her chest that came from being seen, being spoken to, being treated as though her thoughts and feelings